In our last discussion here of the semester, we're going to consider the positions of various scholars debating Neo-Vedanta as a term. Before we begin, I do want to highlight some of the influence of Neo-Vedantism on Europe and also of Europe on Neo-Vedantism, as well as, in the case of North America, that mutually influential relationship. Neo-Vedanta has been influenced by European and North American ideas, but has also had the reverse influence on European and North American ideas about religion. Due to the colonization of Asia by predominantly Western Europe, since the late 18th century, an exchange of ideas had taken place between especially Western Europe and East and South and Southeast Asia, which also influenced the religiosity of Western Europe and then also consequentially North America, including the United States, Mexico, and Canada. In 1785, there was the first European translation of a Sanskrit text, which marked the growing interest in South Asian culture and languages in Europe, while the first translation of the Upanishads appeared in two parts in 1801 and 1802, which influenced Arthur Schopenhauer, who called them the consolation of my life. In other words, we begin to see by the early 19th century very influential German public figures shaped by Asian, and especially South Asian in this case, religious concepts. Early translations of the Upanishads also appeared in other European languages, and a major force in the mutual influence of South Asian and Western European religiosity was the Theosophical Society, which also had pretty strong influence in the United States and Canada as well. It searched for ancient wisdom in the East, quote unquote, and spreading, quote unquote, Eastern religious ideas to the West, right? So it was this framing of this as an East-West dynamic, although, of course, we know that to get to Ho Chi Minh City, for example, from New York, you travel west, not east. In any case, geography aside, one of the salient features of the Theosophical Society was the belief in, quote, masters of wisdom, beings, human or once human, who have transcended the normal frontiers of knowledge and who have made their wisdom available to others. The Theosophical Society also spread European and North American ideas to South Asia, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia as well, but we're focusing on South Asia, aiding in the modernization of, to a certain extent, some of these traditions. Although when we say modernization here, we're not saying to make modern. They were already modern, but modernist is a sort of rhetorical turn within especially Hindu religion. So Hindu modernism grows out of this relationship. Another major influence here is, of course, Vivekananda, who had popularized his modernized interpretation of Advaita Vedanta in the 19th and early 20th century in South Asia, but also especially in the United States, and traveling to Chicago, appearing in the World Parliament of Religions, and emphasizing anubhava or personal experience over scriptural authority, speaking to especially American religious contexts in that sense. So according to the Hindu studies scholar Larson, the solution as synthesis prevailed in the work of Ram Mohan Roy, Sahid Ahmed Khan, who's a Muslim reformer, a Muslim modernist who we speak about in History 122, Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekananda, Muhammad Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a major figure, also mentioned in the 122 course, Muhammad Iqbal, also in the 122 course, and then V.D. Savarkar, mentioned in the readings, Jawaharlal Nehru, major modernist figure, major nationalist figure, first prime minister, first head of state of the Republic of India, and many others. Spear voices appraisal of this solution of synthesis, while G.R. Sharma emphasizes humanism of the Neo-Vedanta traditions. This being said, within the field of religious studies, of course, there's always substantial debate, and therefore there were various criticisms of Neo-Vedanta as a term. Vivekananda's presentation of Advaita Vedanta has been criticized also for its misinterpretation of Advaita Vedanta, specifically from Hindu scholars who are themselves Hindu, without calling into question the right of any individual philosopher to interpret Advaita according to his own understanding of it. There was an assertion that the process resulted in Vivekananda essentially quote-unquote westernizing and obscuring the core of this school of thought. So that was one form of criticism. And then there were, of course, other criticisms as well, and we want to be distinct in these criticisms, noting that there is an emphasis sometimes on Anubhava as personal experience over scriptural authority, but Shankara sort of was criticized for deviation in this sense. Who saw knowledge and understanding of the scriptures as the primary means to moksha, so sort of criticizing this individualist interpretation, saying, no, there needs to be a scriptural, liturgical interpretation. And then there were, of course, critics of Shankara who asserted that, in fact, it was the overemphasis on text that was too Western, again, within quotes. Now, according to Commons, the emphasis on samadhi is also not to be found in the Upanishads, nor with Shankara. For Shankara, meditation and nirvikalpa and samadhi are means to gain knowledge of already existing unity of the Brahman and the Atman. In the 21st century, so here we're speaking quite contemporary, Neo-Vedanta has been criticized by Hindu traditionalists for the influence of radical universalism, within quotes, arguing that it leads to a, quote, self-defeating philosophical relativism, and has weakened the status and strength of Hinduism, all of those within quotes, sort of paraphrasing here. So there are various positions that you can see coming out of these debates. Now, as I mentioned, in the 20th century, the German Indologist Paul Hacker used the terms Neo-Vedanta and Neo-Hinduism somewhat polemically. In Paul Hacker's work, he was actually criticizing modern Hindu thinkers themselves. Halbfass regards the terms Neo-Vedanta and Neo-Hinduism or Neo-Hinduism as useful and legitimate but convenient labels, yet criticized Hacker for using them in a way that was too, quote, simplistic. So even within Halbfass and Hacker, there was debate and discussion over these terms. Furthermore, Halbfass asked, what is the significance and legitimacy of the term neo or neo here, if you're sort of paraphrasing, in expressions like Neo-Hinduism or Neo-Vedanta or Neo-Vedanta? Could we speak of a Neo-Christianity as well? And this is actually what Halbfass raised as a question. Never mind the fact that later contemporary religious studies scholars did actually speak of a Neo-Christianity. That point aside, Halbfass argues, and this is a direct quote from him, in fact, I have used this term, but not all of my Christian readers and reviewers were happy about the term. Halbfass wrote that the adoption of the terms Neo-Hinduism and Neo-Vedanta by especially European scholars reflected essentially Christian and European claims and perspectives which continued to be an irritant to South Asians in the present. For Hacker, who responded to this criticism, Hacker stated the Neo and Neo-Hinduism implied a lack of authenticity, an apologetic accommodation to what Paul Hacker viewed as Western ideas, within quotes, and a hybridization of traditions. So the question then becomes, how do other scholars respond to this debate between Halbfass and Hacker? Well, Bagchi and Atluri, other scholars of the field of Hindu studies, argue that German Indology, especially including Hacker, was merely a barely disguised form of religious evangelicism. In other words, they argue that wasn't scholarly. According to Malhotra, an Indian American Hindu writer who's also contemporaneous somewhat, perhaps better said as a modern thinker, Malhotra asserts that Paul Hacker popularized the term Neo-Hinduism in the 1950s to, quote, refer to the modernization of Hinduism brought by many Indian thinkers, the most prominent being Swami Vivekananda. In Malhotra's view, Hacker charged that the Neo-Hindus, most notably Vivekananda, have disingenuously adopted Western ideas, here Western within quotes, and expressed them using Sanskrit. Malhotra also notes that Hacker was a biased Christian apologist. That's his criticism of Hacker. What is less known about Hacker is that he was also an unabashed Christian apologist more broadly, who freely used his academic standing to further the cause of his Christian agenda. So it was really explicit religious evangelicism. This is quite distinct from a modern religious studies or even contemporary, very, very distinct from a contemporary religious studies position, which attempts to be much more neutral. Now, Hacker led a sort of parallel life, passionately advocating for Christianity in one sphere while presenting the academic face of being neutral and objective, but using very Christian terms in another sphere. This distinguishes him from later religious studies figures who don't really have different actions in different spheres of their lives. Nonetheless, according to David Smith, Hacker's belief was that the ethical values of Neo-Hinduism came from essentially what was a Western European philosophy and Christianity just presented in Hindu terms, which parallels some of the Hindu nationalist interpretations of the same movement, but in the reverse, arguing that essentially the Christian terms were just an attempt to understand Sanskrit terms with an inability to do so. So you can see that the debate's getting quite heated here. Nonetheless, you see some of these later positions resulting in Bankim Chattopadhyay, Aurobindo, Gandhi, Radhakrishnan, and others being involved in these debates. To close, I want to close with a focus on the arguments of Rajiv Malhotra, who in his book Indra's Net has stated that there is a, quote, myth of Neo-Hinduism. Basically, he says the entire idea of Neo-Hinduism or Neo-Vedanta is a myth. According to him, there are 8 myths of Neo-Hinduism, such as, quote, colonial Indology's biases were turned into Hinduism, and Hinduism was manufactured and did not grow organically. These are ideas, positions that he says are myths. Malhotra denies that Vivekananda manufactured Hinduism, or that Neo-Vedanta suppressed the traditions of the Indian masses. According to Malhotra, there is a, quote, integrated, unified spiritual substratum in ancient India. And Malhotra argues that branding the contemporary Hinduism as faux and Neo-Hinduism is a gross mischaracterization of both tradition and contemporary Hinduism. It is not in any way less authentic or less Hindu, in other words, and may be than what we may dub to be traditional Hinduism. In other words, there are new traditions, but they're traditions nonetheless. There are also negative connotations with the term neo or neo, which implies something artificial, untrue, or unfaithful to the original source. In other words, world religions have undergone similar adaptations in modern times, and Malhotra argues back that references to Neo-Christianity and other sort of Neo-Judaism, for example, resist the wide currency being gained for the term Neo-Hinduism, because there is this fictional divide, and this is a direct quote, between Neo and original Hinduism, which subverts Hinduism intentionally. According to Malhotra, the myth of Neo-Hinduism is used to fragment Hindu society by putting its spiritual giants against one another and distorting the subtle and deeply intricate viewpoints and similarities across the traditions. Also, according to him, the definition of Neo-Hinduism has been contrived and gained authenticity in part because it suits certain academic and political and agendas, and in part because it has been reiterated extensively without adequate critical response. Therefore, I'm not going to ask you to take a position in the debate, of course. I don't expect anybody in this class to be qualified to do so. Just based off of your knowledge of the course in its entirety, go ahead and point out something significant in the course at any point from the deep past, from where we covered the Vedas up through the early modern period, all the way up through the modern period, and then tie that into this debate in some fashion. Go ahead and make a quick post to wrap up, and great work, folks. Well done.